Ladies and gentlemen, I was pleased to be invited to speak to your conference on Yugoslavia. Unfortunately, my physical condition and circumstances bar the travel involved. In lieu of actual presence, I have prepared some observations for long-distance delivery by other means. My remarks will be directed at the legality of NATO's bombing of Yugoslavia as a method of compelling the Yugoslav government to accept the NATO occupation of Kosovo, the hypocritical pretext used to justify bombing and occupation, and some accomplishments alleged of the bombing and occupation. After the success of the Western powers, or NATO, in dividing Bosnia into 3 ethnic enclaves, each unremittingly hostile to the other 2, the powers decided that they had a further duty to regulate Serbian affairs in Kosovo, the historic heartland province of Serbs. A Serb minority was allegedly persecuting an Albanian majority of post-war immigrants. Serbs did completely dominate the administration, policies, and policing of the province. The Albanian KLA, once identified as a terrorist organization by the United States, was in response engaged in ambushing Serb police and administrators. And the Serbs were certainly shooting back in what amounted, nevertheless, to a low-level civil insurrection. NATO leaders some 2 years ago convened a meeting at Rambole with Yugoslav officials at which NATO delivered a non-negotiable ultimatum to the effect that Kosovo must be turned over to NATO rule with a view to ultimate Albanian independence of the province. The ultimatum was backed by a threat to pound Yugoslavia into submission. The Yugoslav government rejected the NATO proposal, with the result that NATO was allegedly forced, for, quote, humanitarian reasons, unquote, to carry out its bombing threat. This resulted in ceaseless day and night bombing with an estimated 14,000 sorties over almost 3 months. Using smart bombs, dumb bombs, cluster bombs, and bombs incorporating depleted uranium, the bombings in the service of humanitarianism killed more than 1,000 men, women, and children. It struck factories, waterworks, electric works, TV and radio facilities, bridges, trains, and ordinary houses, to say nothing of the Chinese embassy. During the period of bombing, hundreds of thousands of Albanians left Kosovo, most probably forced out by Serb troops. The question becomes, given the alleged purity of NATO motives having the objective of assuring truth, freedom, and the American way, was this bombing subject to any censure under international law? The short answer is that the bombing was an act in flagrant contempt of international law and criminal under that law. As a primary source of international law, the judgment of the Nurenburg Tribunal in the 1945-46 case of the major Nazi war criminals is plain and clear. American and British leaders often rhetorically invoke and praise that judgment, but they obviously have not read it. The International Court declared, and I quote, "To initiate a war of aggression, therefore, is not only an international crime, It is the supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes in that it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole, end quote. At Nuremberg, the United States and Britain, particularly, pressed the prosecution of Nazi leaders for planning and initiating aggressive war as the ultimate crime. Supreme Court Justice, United States, Robert Jackson, the head of the American prosecution staff, asserted that launching a war of aggression is a crime and that no political or economic situation can justify it. The United Nations Charter views aggression similarly. Article 2, 4, and 7 prohibits threats of force or the use of force by one state against another, and interventions in the domestic jurisdiction of any country. The General Assembly of the UN, in Resolution 2131, which is a, quote, declaration on the inadmissibility of intervention, unquote, reinforced the view that a forceful military intervention in any country is aggression and a crime without justification. Putting a NATO label on aggressive policy and conduct does not give that conduct any sanctity. This is simply a perversion of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, formed originally as a defensive alliance under the UN Charter. The North Atlantic Treaty, at its outset, pledged its signatories to refrain from the threat or use of force in any manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations, and it explicitly recognized the primary responsibility of the Security Council of the United Nations for the maintenance of international peace and security. Obviously, in bypassing UN approval and avoiding the risk of a Russian or Chinese veto for the bombing, NATO ignored and violated its basic obligation. From another standpoint of international law, the conduct of bombing by NATO constituted a war crime, I believe. Contrary to the beliefs of our war planners, unrestricted air bombing of civilian locations is barred under international law. Bombing the so-called infrastructure of a country, waterworks, electricity plants, bridges and factories, is not an attack limited to legitimate military objectives. Our bombing has also caused an excessive loss of life and injury to civilians, which violates still another international standard. When the NATO bombing began, there had been no widespread atrocities and massacres in Kosovo, and the large-scale exodus of the Albanians was not underway. This was not, in any case, the concern of the NATO Rambouillet Dictate, which reflected some curious considerations. Thus, NATO required that Yugoslavia revamp its economy along so-called free market lines. NATO also demanded the right to move NATO troops in and around all of Yugoslavia, such troops not to be subject to Yugoslavian law and jurisdiction. In effect, Yugoslavia would become a Shanghai-like foreign colony of the early 20th century variety. Pretending that an effect of the bombing was its cause, NATO apologists have pointed to the mass exodus of Albanians from Kosovo as an international crime. In my view, it may well be. However, the hypocrisy involved in this pretext for murder from the skies would be shameful were such hypocrisy not so commonplace. When the Croats supported by NATO backing and encouragement, drove the Serbs from the Krajina area a few years ago, with 200 to 300,000 Serbs forcibly expelled from their homes. This conduct evoked no criticism from NATO humanitarians. Currently, with Kosovo under benevolent NATO occupation, some 100,000 or more Kosovo Serbs have been forced into other parts of Yugoslavia under threats of murder by the KLA. Who condemns or prevents this exodus? It has been estimated that during the whole period of NATO machinations, 700,000 Serbian refugees have been driven into Yugoslavia. This has produced a deafening silence in both the New York Times and the London Times, and from the US State Department and the British Foreign Office. Tens of thousands of Roma, so-called gypsies, have also been forced out of Kosovo. But after all, I suppose, there is a limit to humanitarianism. Currently, the KLA has initiated attacks and killings in areas of Yugoslavia beyond the borders of the Kosovo province. NATO, which has a duty as Kosovo occupier to maintain law and order and to preserve the existing rights of citizenry, and at a minimum to keep the peace, appears to be helpless. If so, what is NATO doing in Kosovo? When I was a young prosecutor of Nazis at Nurenburg, I read the court addresses of Justice Robert Jackson, who at one time stated, and I quote, "If certain acts in violation of treaties are crimes, they are crimes whether the United States does them or whether Germany does them. And we are not prepared to lay down a rule of criminal conduct against others which we would not be willing to have invoked against us." My excuse for believing this statement is that Justice Jackson believed it, and I was young, naive, and credulous. Today, I cannot be persuaded that random destruction and killing in Yugoslavia by strong powers against the weak was anything less than killing in the service of arrogance, and I repudiate the shabby pretext for this criminal conduct.